welcome to the History Slam podcast from Activehistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, on campus at Carleton University. And here in Ontario, there was a bit of a big news story with the provincial Conservative government having a resolution passed at their convention with respect to transgendered individuals. Now, normally, for those of you who listen frequently, you know that I try my best not to be reactionary and get too much into news stuff, and that's not what this episode is about, although I'm sure we'll talk about it, because this book has been on the radar for me for a while, and fortunately we were able to set this up for this week, and I'm very excited to talk to Ann Travers, an associate professor in sociology from SFU, about the new book, The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. And Ann joins us from what is undoubtedly a much less snowy Vancouver, British Columbia. Welcome to the show.
It's shockingly sunny here, too, because yesterday it was a monsoon, it felt like. But today, the leaves are sparkling in the sun.
Well, congratulations. We're all very happy for you here in central Canada, where the snow's been on the ground here already for a couple of weeks. And our friends at Environment Canada are calling for another 5 or 10 centimeters tonight.
Wow.
Yes, so let's distract from the misery that is November snow to talk about the new book here, again, The Trans Generation, How Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution. So normally we do have a lot of historians on the show. We've had people from sociology before, but just for anyone listening who is more used to a history approach, history methodology to this, how does a sociologist go about looking at this book versus what a historian might do?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that while plugging the recently published work of my colleague, Dr. Julian Gill Peterson, who has published a book called Histories of the Transgendered Child, History as a Tool for Justice. I'm really excited about their book. But what Dr. Gill Peterson does is they were in the archives of the Harry Benjamin Institute and at Johns Hopkins. Like, they went back and looked at archival literature, case files, etc., letters that kids wrote to Harry Benjamin to show that transgender children are not new, that, you know, they've been around for a really, really long time, and that there's just this, you know, historical amnesia. So that kind of work is incredibly important. It's not what I do, however, though. I've interviewed trans and gender nonconforming children and youth and parents of trans kids. I've attended conferences for children and families, trans kids and youth and their families. I've, paid a lot of attention to media issues. I've also intervened in my local community on behalf of trans people of all ages. So I'm more focused on the ways in which trans people are outsiders, how trans people experience discrimination. And I seek to intervene in that. Like, I seek to push for institutionally just changes.
And this is then obviously both with SFU and then at the community level as well, which is great in terms of the outreach and making those connections. But with this type of book, and given, not that I'm overly familiar with the trans community, but you read stories about the struggles of trans youth. How do you find individuals to interview, given, and we'll talk about sort of the way the community is in terms of who has the privilege, who is in position to be able to be out and be supported. How does that go? How do you go about finding individuals to interview?
Well, I mean, you've raised a good point that the trans people who tend to be visible are the ones who, in spite of the fact of being very vulnerable, they're less precarious than the trans people whose voices don't get heard, and certainly the trans kids who remain pretty much invisible because they don't feel it's safe to show themselves, or trans kids who, are living in poverty or, struggling under colonialism as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis people. So you're already going to be, reaching the most privileged of an incredibly vulnerable group when you seek research participants. A lot of it is trust-based. I identify as trans myself, non-binary, and I think that I've gained credibility in trans communities and around my work on behalf of trans kids with the local school board, etc. As a result of this kind of advocacy, I have made connections with trans kids and their families, and they've seen me standing up for them. So their willingness to talk to me, results from the kind of confidence they have in me. Also, once you start talking to some trans kids or trans youth, they are often in a position to refer you to others. It doesn't mean they don't give me contact information. That's obviously not how research ethics works, but they'll say, look, I have a couple of friends. Why don't I send them an email with your contact information, and I'll ask them if they can help you with your research. So I've experienced a lot of kindness and generosity. I've also found Facebook groups for parents of trans kids and Facebook groups for trans youth themselves, and I've contacted the facilitators and asked for permission to put out a call for participants, but I'm always very frank about my own positionality. They know that they're going to be talking to somebody who identifies as trans and who stands very firmly on the side of trans people of all ages. So I think that helps. But there's no question that it's a lot easier to find people, as a white professional person myself, it's a lot easier for me to find people who are more like me, meaning relatively well-off white trans kids and their families. And I've been successful in interviewing, some trans kids and some families of trans kids who don't fit into that demographic pattern, but the easiest access I have is to people who are very much like me. So I always have to keep that in mind and not normalize or center my own, identity and privilege in my writing.
Right, because that obviously would be I don't want to say an easy thing to do, but something that could take place, because in just listening to you talk, given your place in the community, it seems like there could be people who would come to you almost even for support to, like if there's a parent, say, who has a trans child and they want to learn more about what that is, what it means. They might not have been exposed to the community, anything like that. Like, does that happen too, where you're looking for research people to talk to for your research, but at the same time they look at you maybe as a source of information to help them with their own relationships within their families?
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm really careful about is that when youth or family members contact me for support, I don't include in that conversation, by the way, can I interview you? I help them. I'm really happy to, be the first point of contact for some people around trans issues, because I feel really proud of my ability to connect them with positive and constructive support. So, I make that my priority. But also when I interview families of trans kids or youth, I believe that one of the really important things that I bring to the table is that I see them for who they are and I listen with great care. And, sometimes I've interviewed trans youth who've been kicked out by their families, who've had to fight like you would not believe to be recognized for who they are. And my matter-of-fact acceptance of who they are and, my treating them with respect and dignity, I believe is one of the benefits that I can give, that as an adult, I see them and I believe they are who they are, and I try to give them as much support as I can.
Right, and I don't want to minimize that, but it's such a simple thing to do, right? To be respectful to people and treat them with dignity. But you're right, that it can have such a big effect. And I want to get into this more, but I just want to head this off before we get any deeper into this. I mentioned at the top the Conservative government of Ontario. Well, the Conservative Party, not the government, did pass this non-binding resolution calling sort of transgendered and gender theory a liberal ideology. And I don't know, and if you want to make any comment on that as someone who's more versed in this stuff, than I am. I mean, as someone who is not a gender studies person, I'm not a sociologist, any of this stuff. I mean, I see through that pretty easily, and how ridiculous that thing is. The government has not put it in place. It's just a non-binding resolution at the party level. But do you want to comment on that at all?
It's very threatening and damaging. I mean, I think about the impact on, trans kids or LGBT kids and youth and people, of just hearing that the ruling party in Ontario doesn't believe that we have the right to exist and doesn't believe that we have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. I mean, that's really alarming. It's really disturbing, especially given that so much blatant transphobia has been happening south of the border. We see with the election of the Ford government in Ontario, an attack on the very, very hard fought for gains of LGBT movements in the past few years, and the slight gains we've made in making the lives of some trans kids just a little bit better. This, in a lot of ways, it's the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario's way of, calling open season on trans people of all ages. And it's really alarming, and it should definitely be taken as seriously as we are taking, the kind of racism that is being articulated by conservative groups these days.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've noticed, I think, in some of the reaction to this from people who were supportive of this resolution, is just a general either misunderstanding of what transgender means, and sort of a basic understanding of gender. And I think one of the things that and I'd be curious to ask you about this, the difference then between gender and sex, and how much does biology play into this versus the social construction of gender roles and normative structures and all that kind of stuff. Like how much does it seem to me to be just a misunderstanding of the verbiage used in this fuels that, or do you think it is more of a situation of genuine hate, for lack of a better term? But
I think the people who can get caught up in this can be ignorant, but I believe that people who drive these agendas are out to maintain patriarchal social control, because the two-sex system, which is actually ideological rather than real, if you look at the research that's been produced by feminist science studies that shows that so-called sex-different studies would be more appropriately called sex similarity studies. And if you look at, the work of scientists in the animal kingdom to show that this notion of only two sexes it's a cultural construction itself. In reality, there's more of a continuum. There's greater variation than just two sexes. So if you are, really determined to maintain, the disproportionate power and privilege that is accorded to men in society, then the two-sex system is a system you need to keep in place. So challenges to that system are incredibly threatening.
And so with the people that you're working with and your work in the community, how are people challenging this structure? Obviously, the book is about creating a gender revolution. What sort of methods are being used by individuals in order to challenge that structure? That is, you're right, it's very much one that privileges certain people above others. So what sort of things can people do, but are they doing in order to challenge that you're finding in your research?
I can give a really good example from Vancouver. A few years ago, the Vancouver Parks Board adopted a trans-inclusive policy that changed the way new facilities were built and structured around gender. For example, at Hillcrest Community Center, the center in my neighborhood, it's a relatively new facility. And there's a large family or mixed changing room where there are a lot of private cubicles, both for changing and for showering. But then there are also men only shower and changing areas and women only shower and changing areas. So there are a lot of options, and there are signs up all over the community center explain that, people's gender identities are more complicated. We might understand that if someone is in the bathroom and you think maybe they don't quite fit, that instead of thinking that maybe they don't quite fit, you just have to trust that they're where they're supposed to be. But, creating spaces that are not organized around the two-sex system, I think is probably one of the best ways to proceed. Indeed, in my book, one of my central arguments is that, on the basis of the fact that the majority of transgender children and youth are invisible because they don't feel it's safe to show themselves, we need to transition the spaces within circular. We need to eliminate sex-segregated bathrooms, sex-segregated sport and recreation and activities, sex-segregated locker rooms, and instead make sure that privacy is available in locker rooms for anybody who needs it. Because I know that there are many people who are not trans, having to change in high school as being absolutely horrible. So I think that there are ways that we can create more welcoming spaces for everyone, including trans kids and youth, by transitioning the spaces away from sex-segregated open chambers or sex-segregated bathrooms. At the same time, we can work with kids from a very early age in public institutions to understand what proper bathroom etiquette is. Because by emphasizing the need to keep boys and girls and men and women separate in bathrooms, we're, acting as if bathrooms are safe spaces to begin with. But for a lot of reasons, they're not. For children and youth, there are spaces that are often outside of adult supervision. And, a lot of things go on in bathrooms that, certainly some of my informants reported that were quite horrible. So, if we were to instead teach kids from a very young age appropriate bathroom etiquette and, really build on the kind of work that people are starting to do around issues of consent with regard to sex and sex, I think that we could create safer spaces. Positioning these spaces away from the two-sex system, trans kids and youth, whether we know they're there or not, are going to experience a much less profound sense of crisis. You don't even put them in the position of having to choose. If you think about it, every time a trans kid is forced to choose, the boys or the girls' washroom or the activity, or, do they want to play boys soccer or girls soccer? For one thing, there are kids who are non-binary for whom no category works for them. And there are other kids who are just profoundly uncomfortable. They don't feel like they're the sex category that they're supposed to be, but they don't have the safety that they need to be able to say it, or if they say it and it doesn't matter, nobody listens to them. So if we stop organizing children and young people according to sex categories, we eliminate that source of crisis and trauma.
Right, but I think one of the pushbacks that we would get on something like that, especially with the physical spaces, is the expense. Like if you look at, so where I am right now here at Carleton University, I'm in Patterson Hall, a building that looks like it was built just after the Second World War, sort of in that 50s era. To retrofit this building would be an expensive thing to do. And one of the things that I've heard a lot from people who are hesitant to move forward with inclusive space has a lot to do with the cost of it. And it's not sort of on the surface, at least, presented as a desire not to be inclusive and to ensure that everyone has a space, but rather one that it's just financially or even physically sometimes not feasible, just given where bathrooms and how that space exists. So what sort of steps can we take, or would you recommend in those to combat that type of argument?
The first thing I'd like to mention is that, that was one of the arguments that was put forward about how, merging drinking fountains and bathrooms for white and non-white people would be expensive because everything was already built. Or enabling access for disabled people into buildings or transit systems, et cetera, would be very expensive, and we might as well just leave it this way because it was so expensive. I think that when you have structures that exclude, you need to change them. And sometimes this can be done creatively. I'm at Simon Fraser University, for example, up in BBC, and in my the hallway that I work, there is a women-only bathroom, there's a men-only bathroom, there's a single-stall, gender-neutral bathroom, and then there's a multi-stall, gender-neutral bathroom. And that is a change from only men-only bathrooms and women-only bathrooms, all multi-stall. Now we have all these options. So it has taken, some renovating, but fortunately our bathrooms needed to be renovated anyway. But I really do think that we have structures that exclude. When we say it's too expensive to change them, we're saying that the people that are being excluded are not important and they're not worth it. And that kind of just proves my point.
Yes, you are. You're definitely right about that. And I think one of the other pushbacks that come from this, as you said, the idea or the notion that gender-specific restrooms and change rooms are safe spaces on their own, and that certainly one of the things that you hear a lot about, and I think this was the bathroom bill in North Carolina, one of the main defenses of it was that young girls now would be under threat from men who would just go into women's bathrooms, and sort of in that sort of discussion, it's a roundabout way to demonize transgendered people as being threatening in a variety of different ways.
Particularly trans women. But the thing is that just fits into the whole stranger danger myth. I mean, the most dangerous place for children to be is in their own family contexts or with people that their families trust. People in positions of authority. Children are typically sexually abused by people that they have a relationship with, not by someone who jumps out of the bushes. I mean, one of the things I talk about a lot is that I believe in Canada there are about 2 children a year who are abducted, and sexually assaulted and murdered by a stranger. Obviously, that's too many. And as a parent, I definitely think about that when I'm organizing my children's lives. But the changes that we've made in the lives of children, because of stranger danger, have actually put them at greater risk. Most children these days, at least in major cities, are driven to school. And there are more children who are, killed or injured in car crashes than there are being protected from, the abduction by a stranger. We've actually created more danger by trying to keep our kids safe from a very, minor threat, like hideous if your kid is abducted. Obviously, I don't mean to underscore or to, make that not seem serious, but really, more children are killed in cars. More children are killed in accidents. There are so many other ways that children are at risk that are not being addressed. So if we really, really cared about safety for kids, we'd be doing things like making damn sure, for example, that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were funded to the same level that non-Indigenous kids are. We'd be, ensuring that clean water was available to everybody, that everybody had adequate housing. We'd be concerned about, the results of child poverty, etc. But we're not. We're focused on the incredible outlier, some stranger who's going to come in and swoop in and harm a child in absolutely despicable and unforgivable ways. But it really takes attention away from the ways in which that children right now are being, systematically subjected to harm, in ways that we could actually do something about, but we don't.
Right, and it also makes me wonder too, like, why do people care about sort of the gender identity of somebody else? This is something I've never understood, frankly. Like, if people can wear what they wear, like they can pee where they want to pee, like these things make no difference, to me. I mean, people are who they're going to be, and you said respect and dignity, and that's all anybody really wants to be treated with. And in your research, when you're dealing with maybe parents who are trying to understand their children, or I don't know how much you get into people who are setting policies against transgender people and trying to talk to them and understand what their position is, but do you have any sense of why people who oppose these sort of ideas of gender fluidity and put in place anti-trans legislation, like, why do they care so much?
Well, I mean, gender has like a really powerful history. I mean, it used to be that women weren't allowed to own property or make decisions about their children or vote. So it really mattered that we knew who was who. Just like, with institutional racism that, has been like formally legal racism, you needed to have people of color not being able to, be treated as white people so that the system of inequality and discrimination would continue. So there's the really, obvious and oppressive side of it. But also, one of the ways in which people, organize their worldview and their social lives is gender. Gender is a very, very powerful system. And one of the things that surprised me when I became a parent myself was how little had changed from when I was a kid. I had nice people, like people I liked, teachers that were generally good, telling me constantly what it meant that, my child was a boy or a girl, or what it meant to have, children of a certain sex. They were explaining my children's identities on the basis of the M or F that, they were assigned at birth. And I was incredibly shocked because I was very committed to having my children like what they liked and express themselves the way they liked and not, be put into boxes, not be told what they're supposed to wear and et cetera. And I found that the unbelievable, effort to teach children that there are only two sexes and which one they are and what's appropriate for each sex. It's so incredibly pervasive. So when you take systems of meaning that people take for granted away, I think there's some panic.
And so then the reaction to that panic would be obviously these sorts of reactionary actions that are taking place. But it also seems to be in the context that, and this is my perception, but I'm 33 years old, so it's hard for me to say anything that happened, before the mid 90s because I wasn't really conscious of anything before then. But it seems to be that the trans rights are an issue that has come into the popular consciousness in the past 5-10 years. I know that the rights struggle has been a lot longer than that, but is it something that, in terms of widespread, this is now part of public policy, is the public reaction to this stronger now that it's more out in the open than it has been? Well,
I guess in some ways, but it wasn't. I mean, still in parts of the United States and Canada, gender nonconforming children are being exposed to corrective therapy, which is incredibly harmful. And there were a lot of government funded studies in the United States and Canada that supported corrective therapy. So, in a lot of ways, what happened when the diagnosis, gender identity disorder in children, was put into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1980, which is the Bible that healthcare providers of all sorts use to diagnose and treat. Then it became contested because prior to that, people were trying to gender correct gender nonconforming children, but when the diagnosis was put into the book, then people started to look at that critically because it went into the book the same time as homosexuality was removed from the manual. So the political response to diagnoses is an important site for activism. And there were books that I think I read stuff in about like 1990 that was problematizing some of this the kind of corrective therapies that were carried on. And really, I think since around 2000, there has been, some visibility around trans kids. And one of the things that happened too is parents of trans kids have formed, social movements and have been advocating for their kids. And one of the things I emphasize in my book is that the social movements of parents of trans kids are disproportionately made up of white, middle and upper class, cisgender mostly heterosexual moms, not because that group of people is more progressive or more accepting, but because they have the resources, both material and cultural, to do a lot of work around gender and sexual identity in schools. I think that, white moms in particular are non-threatening, and what they're able to do in a school context to get schools to do gender and sexuality differently is really worth keeping in mind. So there's a really important amount of cultural work that has been carried out. And one of the audiences that I have in writing my book was these moms, just to remind them not to center the whiteness and the relative wealth of their own children in their advocacy efforts.
And isn't there a certain irony in that that if it's white women, white mothers who have that cultural capital to do this, but they're doing it in spaces where traditionally they would be expected to be, so they're in spaces where they have this cultural relevancy, and they're changing it through the power they have because of the expectation that they have. Is there an irony in that?
There is an irony, and sometimes it's frustrating to see how much power white moms have, but I catch myself pretty quickly and think, thank goodness they're using it for good.
Right. Yeah.
And part of my outreach effort is to reach these relatively well-off white moms and parents of extremely vulnerable but relatively trans kids, and get them to trans kids in all their variety. I see these moms want to make sure that the trans kids in their schools are getting fed, are getting supported, that healthcare is available. I mean, and that's a real dividing line, especially in the United States, but still in Canada, in terms of who has access to trans-affirming healthcare if they need it. Most trans people of color will never access trans-affirming healthcare. Some because they don't want it, but also some because it's just an impossibility.
Right.
And so, who is going to be able to take advantage of certain, gains? That's a factor as well.
Now, in talking about who has access to that, though, what is it about other groups? So if you say that it's sort of middle class, upper class, white individuals who have, generally speaking, the resources, and the families are supportive in a lot of cases, as you mentioned with white mothers, why is that not translating to other groups? What are the systems or the social environs in place that it's so specific as to which kids have that supportive environment?
Well, let me make a corrective. It's not that families of color or First Nations, Inuit, and Métis or poor families don't support their trans kids. They just don't have the resources, or they're so busy fighting racism or dealing with, insecure housing, etc., colonialism, that they don't have the resources. They're literally seeing their kids rendered vulnerable in so many different ways that their kid being trans or gender nonconforming doesn't necessarily go to the top of the list. It's incredibly false to think that communities of color, families of color, are less tolerant of trans kids than white ones, especially when we think about all the white conservative families and their intolerance. I mean, the major movements of opposition to LGBT rights are white Christian families. They're not communities of color. I think that, just like white communities of color are characterized by great diversity around issues relating to gender and sexual identity. But kids are just as likely to be accepted by families of color as white families, but their parents, if their parents just don't have the resources. often, like, imagine being a single parent and, you're working, like, and you're taking care of your kids. You can't take the morning off necessarily to go in. I mean, when I talk to some of the moms, mostly moms, there are some dads, but the mostly moms, the amount of time and energy they put into supporting their kid is amazing. Some go into their kids' schools and give free gender workshops to the staff. Like, they do the training themselves. So they have the time. They also, they tend to be gender professors, or they're people who have educated themselves to an extraordinary degree when they, found themselves parent of a trans kid. So, but you're talking about incredible privilege to be able to have that time and access to resources, as well as to have the kind of demeanor that has school staff willing to talk to you. Like, I know with my own kids, when I go into a school and I talk to a teacher, or I talk to the principal if I have a concern, if I'm not satisfied with the answer, if I feel that my child is being underserved, I know who to talk to and I know how to talk to them. And that's part of, growing up middle class with professional parents. You have that toolkit. And I also have the kind of flexible job that makes it possible for me to, reschedule what I'm doing most days and go in and talk to the teacher or principal at my child's school. And that is not something that a lot of parents have.
And then it seems to me that the result of that would be that, as you've mentioned, that the public face of the transgender community then becomes a white face. Like, the majority of the advocates that you see and the leaders of these movements tend to be white individuals. And does that further then compound the problems for those marginalized kids, that not only within their own families do they not have the resources, as you mentioned, to push for things, but also when they turn on the TV or on the internet, wherever, where they're finding the people in the public space that they don't necessarily reflect their own situation.
Yeah, I think that trans kids generally are, very underrepresented. So I don't think that, I don't think many trans kids see themselves reflected. But one of the things that some of the parents of trans kids that I've acted with have done is they take their kids to conferences for trans kids and their families. And in spite of the fact that these conferences regularly offer bursaries and whatnot, they still involve travel and staying in a motel, and maybe, they don't have to pay the conference fees if they can't afford them. But that's like out of reach for many families, to go to Seattle or LA or Berkeley. I'm just familiar with the conferences for trans kids and youth and their families on the West Coast. I mean, that's just not accessible to a lot of people. But what does happen for kids who get to go to those, they do see other kids like them. And, they often experience that as a lifesaver. Mind you, one thing that is happening with trans kids and youth is they get online pretty quick. And there is greater diversity, I believe, among trans youth online groups because the barriers to participating are so much less.
Yeah, sort of just in preparing for this today, I did a quick look at some YouTube channels. And there's a bunch of different YouTube channels that seem pretty wide-ranging in terms of the topics discussed and also the individuals who are the face of them. Pretty diverse group. So having access to that sort of material, and certainly there's been a lot of discussion about YouTube and the whole sort of family feature that has made it harder to find LGBTQ content on there. But, there is some availability of that material, so kids can go find it, and that leads to a question. The subtitle of the book, of course, how trans kids and their parents are creating a gender revolution. In pushing the community, pushing for greater recognition and the rights and having space and making everything be more equitable. What is the end game, if there is even an end game, of the revolution that you're talking about, and what is happening in these communities that is forcing this change, this revolution that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I can only speak about what I want the end game to be and what what I would like to see happen. And that is that trans inclusion shouldn't be separated from other social justice struggles. Like, as an advocate for trans kids, I'm also wanting to make sure that all kids have a warm and safe place to sleep, that schools are safe and supportive places, that they have enough to eat, that the Canadian government get it together and establish genuinely just relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, which involves, in my mind, the return of significant chunks of land. Like, all the things that are necessary to make sure that all trans kids are okay can't be separated. But, as an interim measure, in the immediate sense, harm can be significantly reduced by transitioning the environments that children and youth circulate in away from sex, the two-sex system. I think that is an immediate way in which, some of the crisis and trauma that trans and gender nonconforming kids and youth experience could be considerably reduced.
And what about on a micro level? Like, I know, so for me, I have a full-time job with Parks Canada as a historian. I teach at night here at Carleton and at the University of Ottawa. I like to think that I'm pretty respectful to the people who I come into contact with, but surely there are things that I could do better in my daily life. And so for anyone who's listening, what sort of things in terms of, again, respect and dignity are those two things that you mentioned early on. What are the things that are sort of on a micro level, day-to-day level that individuals can do to either contribute to this gender revolution or if not be an active participant, at least, make sure that the environments that they're creating are welcoming?
Well, avoid organizing people in gendered categories is a first step. When you are going to talk to a group of people, you don't need to say ladies and gentlemen, for example. And it's so problematic anyway because, ladies is a term that, was associated with middle and upper class white women. But, you can talk to, hey, folks, people, when you're talking with groups of young people, hey, people, like, hey, boys and girls, or hey, young men. You don't need to do that. You can stop talking about people in terms of gender categories. You can stop yourself when you think you're going to make a stereotypical remark. And the thing is, much like unlearning racism, we're going to make mistakes. It's hard to change the way that we've been socialized, that, things seem so naturally. It's difficult to make the change, but it's absolutely important. We are going to make mistakes. You make a mistake and you go, I'm sorry, let me correct that. One of the things that I've been working on, which I find very difficult, is unless someone explicitly tells me what their pronouns are, I'm trying to refer to everyone as they. For some people, it's very important that that you call them she or he, and I always respect that. But I'm trying, like with, groups of students, for example, if I'm referring to a student, I'm trying to use they, and I fail a lot, but I'm working at that. I'm trying to, use a gender neutral pronoun, as my go-to, as my, my basic thing. So I think that can make a huge difference, that you just stop the gender, policing that you do unconsciously or consciously, and, just try to be a bit more open-ended.
Yeah, and I think with pronouns, it's an interesting one. I struggle with they too because of the grammatical thing. It just sounds weird to me to refer to an individual as they. So I think what we should do as a country, if not sort of a whole language, is just let's come up with a new word for a singular pronoun to refer to an individual that isn't he or she, and then we don't have to use they, and we can keep they for a plural. I don't know if that's even possible, but I don't know. That's a struggle that I have with it.
I think they works really well because we still use it for a single, I asked her, but they didn't want to, it's right. Not that weird. I think they is sort of right there, and we can let go of, I don't really think it's grammatically incorrect. And I also think grammar is only, idiomatic anyway. We just, say these rules are somehow institutionalized, but we change our language all the time.
Yes, you're right. We do change it all the time.
All the time. And, like I said, I find it really difficult because I'm so used to he, she, but, one of my current goals is to use they as my default. And I believe that, within a year or two, I'll get really good at it. But right now I'm not.
Right, like with anything else, it takes time, and especially with speech patterns, right? You're just so used to saying the same things, or you have these patterns that you just get ingrained, and it's hard to make that change. And for me, you mentioned a bunch of terms that people can use instead of ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I'm a big fan of y'all. I don't know why I started that. I grew up in Southern Ontario. I've been to the South a couple times. I have no idea, but I love using y'all. For some reason. So that's another one.
Specific.
Right, yeah. So, and I know my mom hates it too whenever we're at a restaurant and the server comes over and says, "Hey guys, how you doing tonight?" She recoils at that. My mom finds that to be just the worst thing in customer service, and it happens every time we go to a restaurant.
Yeah. Or I coach Little League, and as it happens, because Little League tends to lose girls, they, for a variety of reasons that are deeply problematic. But, typically when I'm coaching, I have an all-boy team. Well, I don't refer to them as boys. I say, hey, team. Hey, everyone. Hey, hey, friends.
Right. Or even
their words. And they want to say, okay, I'll be the bat boy. And I convinced them, no, we're going to do the bat creature. And you explain, picking up a bat has nothing to do with gender. And at first they're weird. And then, they're calling it bat creature. And then they come back and go, no, I want to call myself the Batmobile. And I'm like, fine, just sort of encourage non-gender specific ways of describing, tasks.
Right. It's a absolutely, brilliant way to do it, and that's interesting to sort of make it, especially with kids, right? To make it do it organically like that makes a lot of sense, and then it's not weird to them when they grow up.
No.
Yeah. So I know I've talked to you for longer than I've taken more time than I said I would, but I just want to ask one question to and then I'll get you out of here on this. With this book, who is your intended audience for this? Is it the obviously there's, I'm sure, a sociological academia audience that will take this in and enjoy it, but in terms of the public, it strikes me as this is something that people who, even if they don't have a trans individual in their family or whatever, this is something that somebody who wants to learn more about what is going on with gender identity could learn a lot from this. And is that something that you had in mind in drafting this?
Absolutely. I wrote it, and with the support of my editor, who really encouraged me in this direction, I wrote it so that, it wouldn't just appeal to an academic audience, that it would, I wanted to educate parents of trans kids, about, some of the biases that, they may bring to, their movements. A lot of them are pretty sharp, but, I just wanted to say, okay, look, while we're fighting for trans kids, let's make sure we're fighting for all trans kids. I also wrote it for policymakers, for teachers, for anybody who interacts with kids. And, I did some readings, shortly after the book came out, and one of them was in New York City at Blue Stockings, and a pair of grandparents were in the audience, and they had a grandchild who they just learned is trans. They were really confused and frightened. And they came to my talk, and, they were there for my reading, and they came up and asked me some questions afterwards, and they seemed to be really reassured. Like I think I gave them the information that they needed to think, okay, like this is actually all right. And this is what I need to do, and this is why. And, so I wrote it really for, the general public in the most, accurate way, that anyone who works with kids or cares about kids or, is interested at all in gender and sexuality, that they have something to learn from it. And the thing that I think is so powerful is that most of the teaching is done by the parents and the kids that I interview.
Right. And it's not just, as you mentioned, in terms of the academic scholarly part of it, it's not just the theory of gender. It really delves into the day-to-day realities of what trans kids are living through and what their experiences are like. So it's not just this abstract academic with, all that kind of stuff. It really sort of gets into what it is to live as a trans individual, and how that then the offshoot of that with parents and familial relationships and all that. So you're right that for people who aren't in a scholarly profession, that this is a book that would be very applicable, because it has that, brass tacks sort of what is it like on the ground information.
Yeah, and I tell people, I say, there's a little bit of theoretical stuff early in the book, but you can just skip that and go to the stories. Like most of the book is based on stories, because I think stories are the most powerful way to, communicate. And yeah, I mean, like there are parts of the book that you might read and go, and just move on, skip it.
Right. Yeah. Go to the parts that you're more interested in there. So, yes. So, again, the title of the book is The Trans Generation, How Trans Kids and Their Parents Are Creating a Gender Revolution, from our friends at the University of Regina Press. The paperback version is available. So you can find it through the University of Regina, and I'm sure at, Amazon and all those other places where people sell books. So definitely do check it out, and very much would like to extend our thanks to the University of Regina Press for helping set this up, and of course Ann Travers, who took the time to join us all the way from a bright and sunny Vancouver. Thanks so much for the time, Ann.
It's been my pleasure, Sean. Thank you.
If you have any questions or comments for the show, you can find us at historyslam@gmail.com. I am at Dr. Shawnee Fever on Twitter. If you have not yet, please do subscribe to the show on Google Play, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your show. Give us the likes, ratings, all that fun stuff to keep the show going. And we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode. But until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.